Hello, this is a short video showing you how to use Studio Pro to create some basic tests on a web-based application and how we can make those tests more reusable by using reusable components. So here we have our application we're going to be testing. It's called UiBank, and within this bank I can now go through and I can apply for a particular loan. And the system will ask me for certain criteria, and then it will report whether I would be accepted for a loan, and if accepted, what that rate would actually be. So what I'm going to do now is go through and create those particular test cases to make sure the developers have implemented that requirement successfully. So what I can do, I can go through my projects and click on New Test Automation Project, and what it will do, it will just ask me to give it a name, and I'll just call it Starter. Click on Create, and now basically it will create for me a blank starting project for me to go in and now create the individual test cases. So it just takes a couple of seconds to create the project, and then we'll see we've now got our blank project. And we do already have a test case holder for us for creating our first test case. So I could put a comment in here if I wanted to, but what I'm just going to do now is start off with a completely blank sequence. And I'm just going to go through and show you how we can now create a particular test case. So I could just go through the recorder, click on web, and now I have my recording capabilities. So here I have my toolbar. And the first thing for any web recording is to tell it where to start from. So I need to open the browser. So if I just click on the browser which is currently opened, it will automatically extract the URL needed to start the particular web application. Now I can go through and actually click on the record, so we can now actually record our interactions with the application. So here you can see we're highlighting the objects as we go through our particular application, and this is important because later on you'll see the activities are referencing these objects individually, and therefore if these objects are moved around on the screen or someone uses a different size of browser, etc., the automations will still actually work correctly. But I can now go through and say, okay, I want to get a loan for, say, 10,000. I want to pay that loan back over 5 years. And now I'm going to tell it that my current annual income is, say, 20,000. And my current age, I'm just going to put in there as 21. If I click on the push button, submit loan, what we'll see is we now get a particular response from the system, and in this instance we would be allowed to take out a loan, and the loan we'd be offered would be at 8% APR. If I press escape now to stop the recording, click on save and exit, we now have the basic framework for what this test case could do. So it will go through, open up my browser, and here you can see the individual activities which actually make up that particular automation. Now these activities are obviously from the recording, but these correspond to one or multiple of the actual activities which come built in to UiPath. So we have over 300 different activities. So for example, if I just do a search on my activities pane here, we click, you can see you've got all these different activities. So we can click on a certain bit of text, we can click on a particular element, we can click on a picture, etc. But the recorder will automatically create these activities for me in here. So we can see we've clicked on the various items, we then entered the text into the various text fields. So now what we want to really do is part of this test, we need to go through and verify that something has indeed occurred which we were expecting. So what I would do now is I could go through and I could click on this plus sign here to say I want to add on a new activity, and if I do my search at the top here, you can see all the different activities which have this keyword verify in there, and what I want is the verify control attribute. So this will now verify a particular attribute of a control I'm interested in. We can also use the drag and drop mechanism. So for example, if I wanted to get the text of a particular element, I can just search for get, and here we can say I've recently used the get text functionality. I can drag and drop that activity as part of this verify control. So now it's going to go in, it's going to use my activity get text, and then be able to compare that with something which is expected. For the get text, we need to obviously tell it what element we want to get the text of, and this is where we now have this link here called indicate element inside browser. If I click on that link, it will now open up my identification system, and I can just basically make sure I'm highlighting the appropriate text I'm actually interested in. In this particular instance, it is value number 8. So what I can now do is to say, okay, part of my verification, I want to verify that that element is indeed 8. So that's the basics now for our first test case. If I run this, what will happen is you'll see It'll open up a new browser and go through to the various locations, enter all my details, and come back and verify that the value was the value we were expecting from the system. So that's great, but what you'll notice there, I've now got two browsers open here. So what I'll do is I'll actually close both of those down. And what we can do is to say, okay, as part of a tidy up for this particular test case, I want to actually go down and actually just close the tab of a particular browser. So I just click on close tab. So that'll close the browser down at the end of my test case. And that's quite important because you want each test case to be completely independent of one another. So therefore they can be run totally standalone and there's no dependencies on previous executions. What we could do now is I could go in here now and create multiple different test cases, testing all the different permutations of data I want for this particular input. But a better way of doing this, and many systems already have lots of manual test cases out there, and you probably have data sets of things you want to actually test. So for example, here I've got a spreadsheet just called loan quotes, and this is used by my testers to say these are all the various different inputs that my system can actually have, and this is the expected rate we can get back out of the system. So what we really want to do is go through multiple test cases each time testing these particular different values. So this is using exactly the same actions, but each time obviously using different data in what we call a data-driven test case. So let's go through and create a data-driven test case and see how easy that is to do. So I can now go in and create a data-driven test case, and I'll just leave it as a default of data-driven. This time it will come up and ask me what is the input data I need for this particular data-driven test case. All I need to do now is go through and navigate through to my spreadsheet. Here it's got the loan quote, click on import, and it's now created for me automatically a data-driven test case. So what we'll see is looks exactly at the same starting point we had before, but the difference this time is we've automatically generated these arguments which are taken from the column names in my particular spreadsheet. So I can use these arguments now within my data-driven test case. So the quickest way to make a data-driven test case is to take a previous test case. So here, for example, I've got my open browser and all the actions. I can just go in there, I can actually copy that. I can go back to my data-driven test case and just basically paste it in here. So I've just copied all my actions. All I need to do now is to go in and say, okay, these particular hard-coded values, I want to use my arguments. So here I've got the email element. So if I look at my arguments, you've got the loan email. So I can now go in to here and say, okay, what I want for my email input is loan. And you'll see you've got the file completion. So it automatically can pick up what is potentially available for you to complete these particular expressions. At this point, it's worthwhile noting that all the particular expressions within UiPath is all based on VB.NET. So anything you can do in VB.NET, you can actually do within UiPath as well. So those of you who've got like a development background will find it extremely powerful to do things like regular expressions and concatenate strings together and do all sorts of other good stuff. So if I just go in there and say this is going to be the loan term, and now I can go down and say, okay, this is going to be the amount that I'm going to actually go in there. So I just put in a loan amount. And then I've got the last one, which is the age. So I just put in there, say, data loan age. Now we need to go through, and this time, rather than verifying a hard-coded value of 8, we want to actually come back and actually make sure that the loan rate is what we've read from our particular spreadsheet. And that's it. We've now created a data-driven test case. So if I save that now, I can go through, I can now execute this, and for testing purposes, I can go through and select an individual data variation. So I could go in there, click on data variation, and what you'll see is we've got all the input values which are basically presented in that spreadsheet. So now I can say, okay, I want to run it with this particular data variation. And what it will do, it will go away and execute that test case on that individual data variation so we can see it going through and executing. That's pretty cool. So that's how quick and easy it is to go through and create very simple test cases and data-driven test cases. What we would then do is we would publish these to Orchestrator. But before publishing them, you want to make sure that you go into your individual test cases and set these as publishable. Because if they are not set as publishable, they won't then be visible when they become published to Orchestrator. This is so that you can have work in progress alongside finished test cases. as and when your projects start to have hundreds or maybe even thousands of test cases embedded within them. We can then go through and publish, and this is going to be exactly the same process as you would for the RPA process with using UiPath. So I won't go into too much detail, but what you need to do if you haven't already is set up a tenant on our community edition of Orchestrator, and you can publish your testing packages to that particular orchestrator and then execute all your test cases from that version of Orchestrator. What I want to show you now is that there's actually a different way of creating automations, which is now being made available with our new product called StudioX. So if I just quickly go in and explain how each of these individual items is working, when we click on a particular menu button here, for example, what we actually have is a target. Now what the target is uses a unique identifier to select a particular item. So here we can see when we're going down our particular navigation route, we need to go in and uniquely identify how we can find that particular object, which is great. And this is again just a string here, so we can actually go in there and you can manipulate that selector using variables, putting wild characters in there, and a whole host of other functionality. But with StudioX, we've actually managed to create a new way of having these targets and have multiple different options for those particular targets. So I'll just quickly show you how that works now. So if I just go through and add another test case, I'll just call it test case 1. What we need to do to make the automations have access to the automation next activities is we need to go through and add that as a package. So if I just go through and do a search for automation next, what we'll basically see is we should be able to go in here and see the automation next activity. So I just want to go through and check that this is the automation next. I'll just do a next. Let's click on all packages. Here we go, we've got the UiPath Automation Next activities. So if I just click on the install here, this will basically install the latest version of the Automation Next activity pack, which will now extend the capabilities of Studio to have access to all of those new activities. And we'll see those will appear in my activities panel within Studio Pro. So it just takes a couple of seconds to make sure any other dependencies associated with those activities are also installed. So here now we see we've got this new item here just called Automation Next. And to give you a really quick overview of how this works, the first thing we need to do is use an application or a browser. So all I need to do now is go in and click on the Use Application Browser, and then I just go through and say Indicate Application. So if I just open up my browser and I can navigate to my banking application, what we'll be able to do is indicate the application that I want to use. So in this particular instance, it's this browser application. And now what I can do is go through and say, okay, I want to do a normal click, for example. So I just want to click on that particular menu. So if I just do drag this over here, I can now click on Indicate on screen, and I can now basically indicate that particular element, click on the actual product. And this is where it's quite cool, because what we can now do is you can actually add on anchors. So you can have a particular element identified relative to another element within a particular screen. But we can also have multiple anchors for the same particular object. So here, for example, we can go through and we can use like a fuzzy selector. So it can use a very hard-coded selector to uniquely identify it. If that then fails, it will go down to a fuzzy selector. And we can even go down and actually identify items via an image as well. So this is how we can basically automatically create a lot more robust automations by using Automation Next, because when anything slightly changes on a UI, it will still actually work correctly. So if I, for example, wanted to make this a lot more robust, I could add an anchor to say the products is always next door to this accounts menu item as well. And that's just going to make my automation significantly more robust. If I click on confirm, what you'll see is we've got a very similar activity, just a click, but we're now using this new Automation Next capability. And you can see you've got a whole host of different other activities you can use with Automation Next. And I would really recommend you go through and look at the documentation and some of the training which is coming out for the StudioX and Automation Next, because I think it's going to be really useful in creating robust and maintainable test cases. But another way to make sure your test cases are more maintainable, is to make sure you don't use the same automations or you don't create the same automations twice. And the easiest way to do that is by using libraries. So you're already seeing that we can import new activities via the dependency, by the managed packages, or we can actually create our own libraries and have these imported into multiple different projects. So for example, if I go through and open up a library, I've got my own UI bank library. So if I open this particular one up, it's a library active project rather than a test case project. That's why it's got the L as the icon. Now, you've probably seen, if you've seen the API testing, we can also incorporate, wrappers around API calls, and we can also incorporate wrappers around Postman activities as well, so we can actually call Postman collections. But what I've done in this particular activity, I've got some API activities, but I've also got a web-based activity. And this particular activity, lo and behold, is exactly what we've just recorded, which is going through and actually applying for a loan quote. But what I've done is, in this particular activity, I've passed in arguments, and I'm saying this particular activity is going to expect these input arguments, and it's going to generate these output arguments. So therefore, I can go through, create my robust automation with these particular activities. Again, I've changed all the input values to what the arguments would be for this particular activity, and the verification, I'm just going to go on there and say the verification will go through and actually verify the particular value is what is expected, and it will return the rate and the loan ID from any authorized loan. So now we've created all of these particular individual workflows, we can now publish this just as we could publish a normal project. So if I just click on publish, what you can do is I've set this up so it's connected to my orchestrator. So you need to make sure it's connected to the community edition of Orchestrator, and you can publish the package and you give it a package name. Here I've just called it UI Bank Lib. And again, all the version control and all the dependencies within any packages is automatically taken care of you, because we automatically use the NuGet package management system behind the scenes, which makes it extremely robust and easy to use. How do I use this library? Well, once I publish that particular library, what I can then do is I can come back and I can create a new testing project, and I can just basically reference that library I've created. So here you can see I've gone through to my managed packages, and here you can see I've automatically said I want to install and use my UI Bank library by Rick. So here you can see I've imported it as a dependency for this particular project. So it now appears in my dependency tab here, and it also means that in my activities I now get a new set of activities, which is UI Bank Lib. And here you can see all the workflows which I created in that particular library. So to use this, all I need to do now is create, for example, a blank sequence, and I can just drag and drop the activity just as I could do with any other activity. So here, for example, I want to go through and create a web loan. Rather than recreating all of that particular automation, all I need to do is pass in some information. So it's giving me some default information here, and then I can say, okay, well, what do I want to do with the output from that particular? So I'm going to get whether it's been accepted, what the quote ID is, and what any rate is. So I've got here a particular example of this. If I go into my web UI test, I've got a web quote retrieval test case, which will go in and it will create a particular loan quote with these particular values, and then it's just going to go through and perform the retrieval of that particular quote. So it's going to come back and actually get my information. So this basically means now that any kind of activities you have in a library is going to be reusable, which makes it extremely quick and easy to create new test cases, but also, and if anything more importantly, it's going to be a lot more maintainable, because if any actions within this particular application change of how I now create a quote, all I need to do is change it in one location, change it in the library, and then all the other test cases which are using that library will not need any modifications whatsoever. So this is how we can really start to really modularize all of your automations within your testing framework to make it very, very easy to maintain and keep in sync with different versions of the underlying applications. Indeed, this library doesn't need to just be for testing. You could obviously use exactly the same library functionality for your RPA automations as well, and that's when you start to really get significant ROI on how you could actually create automations in a most optimized way to get the maximum benefit out of your automation costs. So here you can see we're going in. I've also used a different browser, you've noticed there, where it went in and created an automation there against Internet Explorer. That's really showing you the very basics of how we can create some automations, create some test cases, data-driven test cases, and ideally utilize the functionality of libraries to make sure you get the maximum benefit of the actual tool.